Hello and welcome back. Today we are continuing our lecture series on the 1920s. Specifically, today we're going to be discussing women during the 1920s. The 1920s is going to be a very significant period of change for women. For most of American history up until this point, women have, been part of the cult of domesticity, or this belief that a woman's place is at home with raising kids and doing housework, that it's not her job to be involved with politics or business. And that's starting to change. By the 1920s, we've already seen the country start to industrialize, which means that the physicality of work is less, which means that women have more opportunities to get out into the workforce. World War I made that clear. Men went to go fight, and women had to step up and take jobs that were traditionally thought of as male jobs. Woodrow Wilson during World War I claimed that we needed to be involved in that war specifically to defend democracy. Women will use that argument after the war to say, President Wilson, you said we needed to defend democracy, but here in America, women don't have the right to vote. We made sacrifices for our country, and we believe we deserve the right to vote. That argument will resonate with Wilson, and he will support women gaining the right to vote, which will happen in 1920, the 19th Amendment. And women are going to, oddly enough, because of prohibition, are going to be able to experience changes in their social life, right? Before prohibition, when, saloons were able to operate in the United States, drinking and going to bars was a completely male activity. But once prohibition happens and alcohol becomes illegal for everybody, it's like, now that it's illegal for everybody, it's not so strange to see women in bars because, if it's wrong for, it's not just wrong for women to be there, it's wrong for men to be there. And so kind of the rules kind of go away. Plus, men got used to seeing women in bars during World War I when they were, in France, where that was much more common. Women are going to actually in the 1920s during Prohibition are actually going to drink more than they did before. But it's not just drinking. It's also the idea that they're interacting with equal footing with men in these speakeasies. They're listening to jazz music. That's, these young women, these flappers that are going to be going to these speakeasies are typically white, educated, upper middle class women going to interracial speakeasies, listening to African American music, jazz music. And so, you were really going to start to see, this kind of opening up of society for women in the 1920s. That's certainly the biggest thing that happens for women is the 19th Amendment, which is passed in 1920, finally giving women the right to vote all across the United States. Before that, it was left up to each individual state. And so, some women in some states had more voting rights than other women in different states. But 1920, all women are going to finally get the right to vote. Women make the argument that, if we fought World War I for democracy, that we needed to have a true democracy here in the United States. That was a good argument. The suffragists, right? Suffrage just means like getting the right to vote. So the female suffragettes are also going to make an argument that, that's connected to the cult of domesticity, oddly enough, that women, his job is in the home and being in charge of morality. If women are given the right to vote, they'll bring that morality to politics. And women will be able to reform the government because they're only going to vote for moral politicians. Now, hey, that's a great argument. Now, are women truly any more moral than men? I think we know the answer to that is that that's not the case. They're generally moral, just like men are generally moral. But they make the argument in the 1920s that, if you want more morality in politics, give women the right to vote. Women or Wilson will support this, and we'll be able to get the 19th Amendment ratified. In reality, women's involvement in politics really doesn't change, politics much, either in the short term or in the long term. Most women, when given the right to vote, initially just voted like their husbands if they're married and their dads if they weren't married. Now, that'll change with time, right? Women, today vote independently of their husbands, for sure. But in the 1920s, if you really think about it, it kind of makes sense. If you're a 40-year-old woman and you were just given the right to vote and you were told your entire life that politics wasn't for you, and were denied an education in politics, either in the primary and secondary grades, or even collegiately, if you happen to be one of the females lucky enough to get an education, it wasn't in politics. And so because it was a relatively new field, the majority of women, not all women, but majority of women, kind of turned to their husbands who had been involved in politics their whole life for guidance. And so that first generation of female voters, we believe, pretty much voted the same way as the closest male to them. That clearly has changed over time, but because, as generations go on, women are just more and more expected to be involved in politics and are able to form their own opinions. There's no real, effect on reform and political corruption, because, just like I said before, there's no real connection to morality and gender. That's not a real thing. So women are initially only given kind of token roles within the government. A change takes time. That should make sense. It's not like these kind of things happen overnight. So the first women in politics are going to be given kind of token small roles. 2/3 of the women in Congress are essentially just finishing the terms of their deceased husbands. So real change will take time. Now, the political changes are probably the most important changes that happen in the 1920s. That lays all the groundwork for the women's movement in the 1960s and 70s, for sure. But there's also going to be lifestyle changes that happen for women in the 1920s. There's women have new social freedoms and social acceptance. We talked about this a little bit earlier when we were talking about prohibition, right? If drinking is wrong for everybody, there's not this added social stigma for women drinking. So like if it's illegal for me to be, as a man, to be in a speakeasy drinking, it's hard for me to look across the bar and judge a woman for being there when I'm not supposed to be here either. So it becomes, oddly enough, when it becomes illegal for everybody, it's more socially acceptable for women. The other thing is men's minds are changing about what's acceptable for women and what's not. Most of these young men, the ones that would find themselves in speakeasies and out in public, they fought in World War I, and they were in France, where women have had more freedom longer. And so it wasn't uncommon to see women in saloons and bars in Paris. And so, these men got used to seeing women in social situations like that and actually had fun dancing with them and, dating and heaven forbid kissing, and, all those kind of things are fun. And when they come home, they want to repeat that experience that they had in France. And so, men tend to lighten up a little bit, about what they believe is the proper role for women. Women are going to start to, be able to act what their mothers would consider to be inappropriately by smoking cigarettes in public, drinking in public. Women have always drank, typically not to the extent that men have throughout history, but when they did, it was almost always in private. Dancing in public is going to start to become more common. And And we mean like doing the Charleston, and wearing kind of like loose flowy dresses, and dancing in such a way as to make their dresses flap around, and which would be considered provocative and wild for the time period, right? A young woman during the 1920s, a flapper, her mom wore skirts that went all the way down to the ground with high lace boots. And so you would never in a million years see a woman's leg in public. Well, flappers wear shorter dresses. They wear low cut shoes. So you can see essentially from the ankle to the knee. And that was considered, wildly promiscuous. And as they dance and their dress flaps around, you might actually get to see a little bit of above the knee in a part of the leg that maybe is not covered by a stocking, and that was like just crazy for the time period. And that's just young women rejecting the social stigmas of their mothers. And so, every generation goes through a rejection of the previous generation. My generation, when we were teenagers, wore big baggy pants. I still remember Jinko jeans that were huge. I mean, you could camp under these jeans. And today, teenage boys wear skinny jeans. Well, why is that? That's not some unique thing that this generation is doing. They're rejecting the generation before them. They're rejecting my generation. They're trying to find their own path. And that's what's happening to women young girls in the 1920s. They're rejecting kind of their mother's lifestyle and trying to find their own path. We're going to see, like I said, changes in the way women dress. We'll go over specific changes here in a minute. Idea is, I have here written that more skin is being shown. That's not actually entirely true. That's only kind of part of the truth. It's different skin is being shown. Sexuality is relative, and Victorian era women typically wore corsets that gave them like an hourglass figure. It cinched the waist. The purpose for that was to accentuate the breasts and the buttocks and give women an hourglass figure. And that was considered beautiful for the time period. You've seen those dresses with, the women who have kind of the low cut tops with the cinched waist. Flappers will reject that. And so when I say more skin shown, it's not necessarily more, it's just different. They'll typically wear loose dresses that cover up the waistline and the chest, but the skirts will be shorter, so it'll be about knee length. And so when I say more skin shown, I really mean more leg being shown and less, other parts. We're also going to see excessive jewelry. That's part of the thing of being a flapper. Flapper refers to not only their dresses and potentially the tassels on their dresses that flap about as they dance and do the Charleston. It's also their jewelry that's going to flap around. And you're also going to see an increase in makeup. For most of history, you're going to see that women typically, makeup's been around for a very long time. The Victorian era, lots of foundation, but generally considered that only actresses and prostitutes wore lipstick. In the 1920s, flappers are going to kind of reject the heavy powdered foundation and more go for, and I'm probably going to mess this up, but rouge and lipstick. Things that were considered like risque for the generation beforehand, before them. So again, and what is that? That's just a rejection of, well, my mom did her thing. Now I'm trying to differentiate myself from her. And so the things that she rejects, I'm going to embrace. And the things she embraces, I'm going to reject. And so, here's a picture of a couple of flappers, dancing to, kind of like ragtime music. We got a big band here playing jazz and swing music. You can see that they're, unlike the Victorian era, like corsets that really, embrace this hourglass shape. You see, looser, baggier clothes, but you do see that the dresses are shorter, and you can see a stockinged leg with shoes that cut below the ankle, which was considered very risque for the time. I think today we would look at that and think, oh, that's tame, right? And it's because, with time, each generation, kind of puts their own spin on what it is, what beauty is. So the flappers, who were these flappers? Well, the flappers typically, they weren't your average woman. The average woman doesn't necessarily really change very much. It still kind of has like, modest Victorian era principles. So the average woman does not look like the woman right here. This is just kind of a quintessential flapper. The flapper is a trendsetter, but is still a relatively small percentage of women in the 1920s. They typically tended to be northern and urban, meaning from a northern city, single, young, and middle class to upper middle class. A lot of times educated, young women, and so kind of not your average woman. As a matter of fact, there's probably not too many rural flappers, although there were some. Right? Now, these women typically would frequent jazz clubs, vaudeville shows, kind of more kind of risque entertainment. That's actually kind of a big deal. And, I want to impress this upon you is it's not just like, oh yeah, great. They listen to a new type of music. Jazz is one of the very few art forms that are uniquely American. And interesting enough, African American. And so, in the 1920s, when the South is still heavily segregated, this is a big deal. It's going to have big ramifications for race relations in the United States, making things better, right? Because you're having these northern white women who are going to see, a lot of times African-American performers in, even potentially integrated, speakeasies and jazz clubs. So that's a big deal. And so, the more that the races can be exposed to each other, the better race relations get. And so, this is kind of a big step forward for society. Like I said, most of these women will frequent speakeasies, which are kind of those hidden bars during Prohibition. And interestingly enough, and we've talked about this before, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, more women will be drinking during the 1920s when it's illegal than before when it was legal. And again, that's because of the way the stigma works. Here are two more examples of kind of how flappers dress. And it's all kind of a rejection of their parents' Victorian style. All right. The Victorian era dress kind of emphasized the pear shape of a woman. We see corsets, very tight undergarments that are meant to accentuate, the hourglass shape of a woman, her breasts and her buttocks. The hemlines, typically of the skirts, were longer. It was risque to expose leg. And so we typically see hemlines at the ankle or lower, a lot of times with high lace boots that make sure that the legs are never exposed, because that would be scandalous. The flapper, on the other hand, kind of wore clothes that gave them almost a boyish look, right? Victorian era women that typically have real long hair. The women, flappers in the 1920s, bobbed their hair, cut it very short. Think like, it always reminds me of like the Beatles in the 60s. It's not the same, but it's kind of close. The looser clothing, give them more of a boxy shape. They're hiding their curves, right? That's the thing that their mother did. They're going to reject that. They also like the boxier shape because like the newest, hottest artist around the world is Pablo Picasso, and he's a cubist. And so the cube is kind of like the art icon, and it becomes a fashion icon as well during the 1920s. We tend to see silk undergarments that aren't as restrictive. We see, the hemlines typically tended to be right at the knee, and if it was really risque, just above the knee, with the stockings rolled down just below the knee. So, kind of as a woman moves, you might actually get to see a kneecap, and that was scandalous for the time period. I mean, like that was like whoa. Which today we think of as kind of ridiculous. But again, it goes to standards of beauty change over time. Women also during that time period tried uh, uh, to de-emphasize their breasts. A lot of these women actually took bandages and tried to tape their chest down. Again, that's a rejection. If their mother was trying to accentuate that, they're trying to de-emphasize it. Shoes were cut below the ankle again, as because the trying to emphasize their legs. More makeup, more jewelry. Again, a rejection of their mother. So we see kind of the two different styles here. You can see the Victorian era where, real kind of, you could see the hourglass that I was talking about. You can see there clearly legs completely covered up. You can see the woman in the middle there, collarbone is being exposed. And the dress even goes down a little further than that. And then you see the flapper on the right, definitely more leg is being shown. You can see that the outfit is definitely more form fitting. She's got shorter hair, and just a significant change from what their way their mother dressed. So we've talked about kind of those social changes, the flappers going to the speakeasies, they're smoking, they're drinking, they're dancing in public, the way that their clothes have changed. We've talked about the political changes for women in the 1920s. They're finally getting the right to vote. So life is changing pretty dramatically for women. And it's going to change for women in the area of sexual freedom as well. During the 1920s, we're going to see sexuality actually being discussed publicly for women. Again, that's kind of there's a lot of things going on there. There's, questioning about whether or not it's safe and healthy for a woman to stay pregnant for most of her adult life. That's going to be an issue with Margaret Sanger. That's Margaret Sanger right there. And there's also the changing standard because of the war. Because American men were exposed to French women during the war. Sexuality's always been a bigger part of daily life in France than it is in the United States. And so when those men come back, and even the female nurses, American nurses, come back from World War I, there's just more, it's more acceptable. There's more women in college now than ever. So it's really, we always talk about women getting educated and how important it is for women to, education is always important, right? But there's another aspect to women going to college that I don't think gets discussed nearly enough. And it's because it's not just about what you learn in class. When more women in the 1920s are going to college than ever before, it's also giving women more freedom, because it's really the first time in American history that women are going to be able to have at least a part of their life that's not either under the control of their father or their husband, right? Before college, women were being controlled by their husbands, by their fathers, all the way up until they got married. And then when they got married, they were at least semi under control of their husbands. And so they never had this time away from some sort of male figure in their life, and college will give them that. And when they have that, all of a sudden there's women hanging out with each other discussing things, and one of those things will be sexuality. And so they're going to have more freedom to discuss and try and figure that out. Right. Women in the 1920s are more likely to experience sex before marriage than ever before. Now, as long as time has existed, there's been premarital sex. That's always been a thing. But in the 1920s, we're seeing an increase in that. Whether it's a good thing or bad thing, that's not for me to say. But It is increasing in the 1920s, and that'll be for a number of reasons. Now, I want to be clear. Most women in the 1920s are still waiting for marriage to have sex, and that's a choice that they're wanting to make. But that is starting to change in the 1920s. Um, and a big part of that is because of birth control and the creation of the diaphragm, which is essentially a female condom. And all of a sudden now, there's starting to be fewer consequences for premarital sex. So we see an increase in premarital sex in the 1920s. And that's a controversial issue, and it was controversial in the 1920s. I think it's still controversial to this day. And we have laws in the United States that are in the 1920s that are trying to restrict birth control because there's this fear that because the more birth control there's going to be, the more premarital sex, that America is kind of losing its morality. And so there are laws that essentially say you can't send birth control information through the mail, and that is going to be challenged by this woman, Margaret Sanger. Right. Margaret Sanger has, a history with pregnancy. She believes that her father killed her mother by just getting her pregnant over and over and over again. And so, she's has, all kinds of siblings, and that takes a toll on a woman's body, particularly in the 1920s when healthcare isn't as good as it is today. And she believes just being pregnant over and over and over again killed her mom. And so she doesn't want to see that happen to other women. And so she really starts to promote birth control for women. It says, women, you don't have to be pregnant all the time. And she makes some good points. If you're pregnant all the time, one, it can be unhealthy. Two, you're never going to be able to get an education if you're constantly, getting pregnant and raising kids. And, women should have choices when it comes to those that aspect of their life. You're not going to be able to get an education. You're not going to be able to get a job. It means you're going to be dependent on a husband. And so, if you should have a choice, when it comes to those things. And so what she does is she challenges the Comstock laws. So those Comstock laws essentially says you can't ship anything obscene through the mail. And birth control at the time is considered to be obscene. And so she challenges those laws. Eventually, those laws will get overturned, and then goes on to help to create Planned Parenthood, which is an organization that is still around today. She's kind of hailed as, one of these early feminists that really help liberate women and, give them the option to prolong the time of their life where they don't have children, which allows for women to get educated and to get jobs and be more independent. All those are great things. Now, on the other side of that coin, Margaret Sanger is controversial. She is a believer in social Darwinism and this idea that there are certain races that are more evolved than others. She does support the idea, and this was kind of the rage in the 1920s. She wasn't the only one that supported it, but the idea of eugenics, and really promoted the idea of birth control in the African American population. So, fewer African Americans would breed. Right. Ouch. That's a belief today that is, very unacceptable. Now, at the time, and this is, one of those weird things about, everybody says, yay, science. At the time, eugenics was a completely acceptable science, in many places around the world, and including the United States. Eugenics is controlled breeding to get the biological results that you want. Today we definitely frown on that, but in the 1920s, it was much more acceptable. It's also a philosophy that Hitler followed, and justified it because that was the science of the day. Right. So we're also going to see in the 1920s an increase in sexual freedom because of the automobile. Before the 1920s, all of a sudden now families have cars. That changes dating for everybody. Pre-car, if you were going to date, right? Somebody showed up to a boy would show up to a girl's house and say, I'd like to talk to your daughter. And they sat on the front porch and, dad, I imagine, just looking through the windows, making sure that the boy is behaving himself. Right. And so you just never could escape the view of parents. And even if you lived close enough to walk into town, town was so small that probably, everybody knew everybody else. And if, the kids didn't behave on their date, it would get back to mom and dad. The automobile changes that. Right. All of a sudden now you can drive to your date's house, pick her up, and then you could drive to the soda shop in the next town where nobody knows who you are. And all of a sudden now, it's not going to get back. Whatever you do is not going to get back to your parents. And so all of a sudden you have a little bit more freedom. We all know when you give teenagers a little bit of freedom, they're going to abuse it. And so, that's normal. They're learning how to behave. And so, that kind of happens. When the automobile, the first cars were all convertibles. When the automobile in the late 1920s, early 1930s starts to get a roof on it, its nickname becomes the bedroom on wheels, which is not what you're thinking right now, but it becomes, like driving to the local park and parking and then, kissing and making out, all of a sudden becomes this kind of rite of passage for kids in the 1920s, which is not a thing that really happened before. I mean, it happened, but not on the scale that it does in the 1920s. And that's because of the automobile. And I would challenge you, think about your life, whether you're a teenager now or I think most of you that are seeing this video are still teenagers. Think about what your life would be without a car. You just when you turn 16, all of the world opens up to you in a way that it didn't before. You have all kinds of new freedoms and all kinds of new opportunities to get yourself in trouble, right? And so the automobile's kind of this, rite of passage for kids, learning how to be adults and experimenting with freedom in all kinds of new ways. So, college campuses, like I said, create new freedoms as well. It's really kind of the first time in American history where women are able to escape their dads or husbands, and so they go off to college. Petting parties become kind of a thing again. Like think of it like make out parties. More kissing, things like that as well. And again, keep in mind, most people are still at this point, saving themselves for marriage, but they're experimenting with their sexuality, at least kissing, casually dating, things of that nature. Like I said, the closed automobile gives kids more privacy. Joyriding becomes a thing. Like even if you don't have anywhere to go, you just drive out into the countryside, and you think, oh, that's so boring, but it's time away from your parents, and that gives you a kind of freedom that you didn't have before. And then, like I said before, most women are still, still believe in love, still believe in waiting till marriage to have sex, and so that is a kind of a myth that the 1920s and then in the 1960s and 70s that all of a sudden we become this really promiscuous culture. That's not true. Most people still want to wait. So that wraps up today's lecture on women in the 1920s. I think there's three big topics we talked about: political change, social change, and new sexual freedoms. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it, and I will see you again shortly.